It's April 1998. A mother goes missing in a quiet northern English town. A month later, her torso is found in a sack, its limbs and its head missing. The man who killed her? Well, he would later claim that he ate part of her thigh with garlic, cheese and spaghetti. He called himself Devil Man, and he freely admitted he wanted to be the country's youngest serial killer. And somehow he nearly got away with it. This is the story of David Harker, cannibal, killer and psychopath. Let's look at the details. Most visitors to Darlington in northern England see a quiet, unremarkable market town. But in 1998, this unassuming facade was shattered by a murder so brutal and so grotesque that it would haunt the local community and the nation for decades to come. Like many northern towns, Darlington had its fair share of struggles. Unemployment, poverty and addiction, all quite common. But nothing prepared the local people for what was about to unfold. Julie Paterson was 31 and a mother of 4. She was fragile and vulnerable, and she'd recently lost the custody of her 4 children in a custody battle with her former partner, Freddie Newman. She was in a bad way and she was spiralling into alcohol addiction and also addiction to Valium. At this particular time, she had a new boyfriend called Alan Taylor, and he would later relate that she often vanished for days or sometimes weeks on end. She was basically going on drinking and drug binges. He was fairly used to it, and so one April night when she didn't come home, he didn't panic immediately, he just waited. Days passed and then weeks, but this time Julie didn't come back. Unfortunately, this is because she had met David Harker. On the surface, David Harker was charismatic and even artistic. He was the frontman, the lead singer of a punk band called Downfall. But underneath the surface, he was dangerously unstable. From childhood, Harker had displayed all of the hallmarks of what was known as the MacDonald Triad. Now, this was a chilling set of behaviours which some scientists linked to future serial killers. The triad included bedwetting, the setting of fires and cruelty to small animals. He'd exhibited all of these. As a child, he had tortured small animals, and at 16 he'd attacked 2 men and violently kicked their dog to death. He constantly called himself Devil Man, and he told anyone who would listen that he wanted to be a serial killer. For the crime of attacking the man and killing their dog, he was placed in a young offenders institution, but he was eventually released and he moved to Darlington to start afresh. Now, he himself had alcohol issues. He could often be seen drinking in the park, sat on a park bench, usually surrounded by young lads younger than him. One of these young lads was a guy called Matt Ferry. David Harker actually moved in with Matt Ferry and his sister Janet and their mother. He went to stay with them for a little while, but it eventually became longer term. He didn't pay them any rent, but he kind of paid them in kind. They thought he was a good guy. He used to help out around the house, cleaning and doing all sorts of odd jobs. But one day in 1998, in a place called Stanhope Park in Darlington, he ran into Julie Paterson. They were observed drinking together, laughing together, and she also seemed quite drunk but happy. And on this particular occasion, Julie went back to Harkin's flat in a place called Harewood Drive. Regrettably, she would never leave that flat alive. Now, what happened in that apartment is quite horrific. It's quite difficult to tell, really. Harker and Julie continued drinking and then they had sex. But after this, something seemed to snap in Harker. He strangled Julie with her own tights, strangled her to death. But things didn't stop there. It would later come out during questioning, or he would claim that he violated her corpse. He would also claim that he then sliced off part of the flesh of her thigh, which he cooked with pasta, garlic, cheese and tomato, and then ate. Yes, you heard it correctly. We're talking cannibalism here. It would seem that he then kept the rest of her body for an extended period in the basement of his flat. He kept her until the smell of her decaying remains forced him to get rid of them. But by this time, people were beginning to ask questions. They were questioning where was Julie Peterson, particularly her boyfriend, Alan. Now, this came to a head when she missed a key appointment to do with her children, and Alan thought she just wouldn't do this. So he called the police and reported her missing. Now, this was on the 29th of April, 1998. The police officer in charge of the investigation was Detective Chief Inspector David Jones. He would later relate that naturally he became very concerned. By this stage, Julie had been missing for about a month. And so, as well as the police investigation, he also enlisted the help of local newspapers. And one of these was the Northern Echo. They ran a story about the fact that Julie was missing along with her photo. Just by chance, someone who knew Harker was coming home from work on the day that the story went out, and one of the first things he noticed when he came into his house was a copy of the Northern Echo with her photo on it. Sufficiently concerned, he got in touch with police, and he related some of the things that Harker had been saying. He advised them to go and have a look in a place called Polham Lane, and this the police did. It was quite late at night when Detective Inspector Ian Phillips arrived on the scene, which had already been cordoned off by police. Because of the darkness, they had to wait until first light, but they knew they'd found something because they'd isolated a sack which appeared to have something not very nice in it. When first light came and the officers investigated the contents of the sack, they were absolutely horrified to find they were the remains of a human being. They could see that it was a torso because they could see the shoulder blades of a human body protruding from the top of the sack. This sack had been found at the bottom of a garden, and the elderly occupant of the house at the other end of the garden had come round to find out what was going on. And at first the lady told the police, "Oh, don't bother with that, a couple of boys just dumped it there, it's the remains of a dog." Sadly, it wasn't, and further investigation would determine that the remains were those of Julie Peterson. Police now had a major murder investigation on their hands. The information, the tip-off that they'd been given to go and search this particular area had come from someone who knew Harker. He'd apparently been bragging about killing someone who he called Roxanne. He'd been telling people that he'd cut up her body after killing her and dumped her in the trash. Nobody had believed him previously, but now things were different, and people were starting to believe what he was saying. The remains that were found in the sack were just Julie's torso. There were no limbs, and her head was also missing. Pretty soon after, 2 officers were dispatched to arrest Harker. Now, these officers were Detective Constable Ian Watson and Detective Constable David Ripley. At the time of the arrest, Harker was being held at a local bail hostel for another offence. The 2 arresting officers would say that when they first saw him, he had quite an intimidating presence. He was about 6'3", he had pretty much a shaved head, and he had 2 tattoos, one on each side of his head. One of the tattoos said subhuman, and the other one said disorder. Nonetheless, he didn't put up any struggle, and they took him into custody and took him for questioning. Now, to begin with, under questioning, he was quite friendly. He said that he hadn't killed anyone. He said the woman involved was called Roxanne and that she had left his flat perfectly alive. But while all this was going on, Harker's flat had been searched by other officers, and forensic evidence was mounting up against him. Inside the flat they found trails of blood, which would later prove to be Julie's. They found her shoes and some of her clothes. They also found some chilling writings or strange poems on the wall, and they found a knife. One of the words on the wall was becoming, and this same word was also written on the blade of the knife. When Harker was confronted with this mounting evidence and basically forced into a corner by the questioning, he began to talk and began to confess what had gone on. He was not only questioned by police, he was questioned by psychiatrists and put through a battery of tests, including brain scans. He eventually admitted to killing and dismembering Julie. And as I've said before, he claimed to have taken some of her flesh and eaten it. He also claimed that he'd made other kills before, but no evidence was actually found for this. They questioned him. Why did he do this? And the simple answer was he wanted to be notorious. He wanted fame, like one of the people he idolized, who was the American serial killer and cannibal Jeffrey Dahmer. He wanted to outdo them and become more famous. When talking to one psychiatrist, he also talked about serial killer films that were in the cinemas. He told them, people like me don't come from those films. It's the people in those films who come from people like me. Julie's family begged Harker to let them know where the rest of her body parts were. Her arms, her head and her legs were all missing. But he refused, and he effectively taunted the family and police. Police would mount extensive searches around Darlington. Harker was eventually sent for trial, and he was convicted of Julie's murder and sentenced to life imprisonment. Whilst in prison, he sent lots of letters to the local press. He wanted to try and gain some notoriety. He wanted them to tell his story. And he also sent letters goading the family and the police. One of these was a riddle regarding the placement of Julie's body parts. This riddle seemed to point towards the river running through Darlington. The riddle read, I have a bank, but I have no money. I have falls, but I keep on going. I have a bed, but I do not sleep. I have a mouth, but I do not feed. Police frogmen searched the river in Darlington, but came up with nothing. Because he'd also said that he got rid of some of the body parts in the trash, police went to a local landfill site. This was a place called Coxhoe Landfill or Coxhoe Tip. And during the search, they went through approximately 20,000 tonnes of rubbish. Again, nothing was found. And as far as my research can tell me, Julie's body parts have not been found to this day. And so her family went on being tortured. What they did have of Julie's body was eventually buried, but they said she wasn't finally laid to rest because she was incomplete. This particularly preyed on the mind of her brother, and he at one time spent months digging near the banks of the River Wear because he was convinced that was where her body parts were. Again, he came up with nothing. And so not only do we have a woman whose life was tragically taken by this monster, some people said that Harker wanted control and that he still had it even though he was in prison. Harker remains behind bars at one of the UK's toughest prisons, Wakefield, alongside some of the most dangerous men in the country. In 2021, he applied for parole, but his parole was denied under something called Helen's Law. Now, this is a law that blocks the release of murderers who refuse to say where their victims are. That's if they've never been found. So to this day, Julie's family do not have closure. Her arms, her head and her legs have never been found. David Harker himself wanted to be remembered, not as a man, but as a monster. And sadly, in some twisted way, he succeeded. But we must remember Julie Paterson. Flawed though she was a mother and she was a woman who deserved better. Her life was stolen, and in that her dignity was violated. And our condolences go out to her family and her friends and anyone who knew her. Let's hope that any further applications for parole in the future by David Harker will also be refused. This is definitely a man who deserves to spend the rest of his life behind bars. And on that note, I'll ask you to stay curious and stay safe. And I'll thank you for watching.